The day I began counting arrived with a blue sky that pretended to be kind. My wife Tessa left the house with a bag she called a project kit and a face that looked almost honest. She said she had meetings that would run late. I nodded and wrote the time on a small card that I placed in my pocket like a compass. I am Noah, and I am a data analyst by trade. My work trains me to notice edges and to trust clocks more than promises. I did not feel rage. I felt a need for order. I decided to give the next 30 days a spine. I changed nothing on the surface. I brewed coffee and cleaned the counter and answered 2 client messages with the polite wait my job expects. Then I opened a new file on my laptop and gave it a sturdy name. I wrote 3 lines. Day 1. Departure at 7:32. Bag with new silver zipper. The file was not a diary. The file was a ledger. I promised myself to avoid adjectives unless I needed them to distinguish truth from a nearby twin. That night, Tessa returned with a story about a brainstorm session and a client who needed a rebrand that would taste like risk and smell like victory. She spoke with hands that loved theater. I set a cup of tea on the table and watched steam rise in a straight line. I asked a question about process, and she shrugged in a way that made my skin remember old winters. When she went to shower, I looked at the hall mirror and told my reflection to be boring and durable. Boring is not a sin. Boring keeps houses standing when wind tries to teach them new lessons. On day 2, I began to move the important things of our life into text. I asked Tessa to confirm our shared bills through email. I sent a message to my bank to enable alerts on withdrawals bigger than a number that used to make me relaxed. I set my phone to archive every GPS timestamp that attaches to photos so that my own movements would be a clean straight line on the map. I ordered a replacement for the doorbell camera that had died last spring and scheduled it to arrive before the weekend. I told myself that I would not spy. I would only hold up a mirror and let rooms describe themselves. Day 3 brought rain and an invoice that did not belong in our shared account. A boutique hotel in Back Bay charged a deposit for a date 2 nights in the future. The confirmation number crawled across my screen like an insect that had gotten lost indoors. I placed the printout in a folder. I poured coffee and tasted none of it. That evening, Tessa said a client had added a late meeting to the calendar. I watched her choose a dress that did not belong to any meeting I had ever attended. I asked if she needed the car. She said she would take a rideshare because parking in that part of the city was ridiculous. I wrote down the time the car arrived and the direction it turned at the end of our street. Before I slept, I walked through the house and looked at objects as if they were witnesses. The sofa knew something. The kitchen island knew more. A misplaced bottle stopper sat in a bowl near the fruit as if it had earned a rest. I turned off lights and felt the quiet thicken. I told myself that a home absorbs truth at the same pace as a person, and that both need mercy while they do it. On day 4, I installed the new doorbell camera with the respect I give to tools that can testify. I aimed it carefully, set the time to the second, and tested the alert. The first person it saw was a mail carrier with a gait that could have taught patience to a courtroom. The second person was me, coming home from a grocery run with staples, and the sense that I needed to cook simple meals for a while. Tessa left that evening with a duffel bag I had not seen since our last trip 2 summers ago. I asked her if she was staying with a friend after the meeting since the weather was still wild. She said she would figure it out. I wrote the words "figure it out" in the file and left them without a judgment attached. Day 5 brought the hotel charge moving from pending to posted. I noted the timestamp and matched it to the rideshare record. The ride had ended at a side entrance not far from the valet stand. Later, I would call the hotel and ask a clerk about parking receipts near our license plate. The clerk would say they could not share without a process, and that if a legal request arrived, they would follow it. I thanked the clerk and did not argue. I did not want shortcuts. I wanted a path that would bear weight when stepped on by strangers. The file grew like a plant that has found a niche on a windowsill. It added a screen capture of a weather report that could help explain shadows on a photo. It added a copy of a dinner receipt Tessa left in the jacket pocket of a coat she rarely wore to work. The receipt included a time that did not match the claim of an early night. It included a dish that she had once called a guilty pleasure, but now ordered without apology. It included a tip that spoke louder than her voice ever would. I folded the receipt neatly and put it beside the hotel page. On day 6, I met with Petra. She is a friend of a friend who once handed me a compassion that fit my hand like a custom tool. She listened and asked short questions and leaned back as if to make room for the facts to enter the air between us. Petra told me to keep collecting, to avoid confrontation, and to refrain from touching any device that was not mine. She said to move assumptions out of my mouth and into a sandbox, where they could play without knocking down any juries. She explained constructive trust in calm terms and said that if Tessa spent shared funds on private adventures, the court might require those funds to be returned to the pool. She said to be ready for friends to choose stories over me for a little while. Then she smiled like a lighthouse. She said to eat well. Day 7 was a Saturday, and I cleaned the house with the deliberate pace of a monk sweeping a stone path. Cleaning attacks panic better than talk does. I opened windows and let the city carry old air away. I washed 2 loads of laundry and folded them with corners neat enough to act as a small argument for civilized life. I found a cufflink behind the dresser that did not belong to me. I placed it in a bag and wrote the location of discovery and the date. I did not tell a story about it. I might never need to. Day 8 arrived quiet and left me a note at noon. An alert dinged for a cash withdrawal near a wine bar, where Tessa once said the music had too much sadness to be comfortable. I checked her shared calendar, and it showed a lunch with a client in another part of the city. I wrote the 2 locations next to each other and let them argue on their own. That evening, she stayed in and watched a show about home renovations that explained themselves too neatly. She laughed at a joke, and I laughed 2 beats later because my mind was counting something else. On day 9, I cooked a stew that can be reheated for days and still tastes like competence. Tessa ate standing up and said new clients were exhausting and that she might take a weekend to reset. I asked where she would go. She said she would let me know. The words were light. The meaning was not. I sent myself an email with the subject line Day 9 Stew and the body line about planned weekend. Later that night, when she fell asleep, I looked at our joint credit card portal and saw a travel charge for a boutique luggage store. New carry-on. Purchase at 18:15. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling until I felt my heart remember the speed limit. Day 10 brought a surprise at work. My junior teammate Ava asked whether I was well because I had started using full stops more than usual. She did not need the story, and I did not give it. I told her that I had a personal project requiring focus and that it would not ruin our deadlines. She nodded and offered to handle a client call that I did not have bandwidth for. She did not know she had offered me a kind of wound dressing. I thanked her and sent a message to Petra to ask about the ethics of involving people from work in anything. Petra replied with a line that ended with the word, avoid. I smiled. Avoid is a good word when temptation tries to dress as efficiency. On day 11, a neighbor with a camera pointed at the street asked if I wanted to see footage from a busy late night. He had filed a report with the city about noise, and he felt like a citizen. I told him that I appreciated his vigilance, and that if any officer needed copies, they would likely be in touch. He said he had begun to catalog license plates as a hobby, and I thought about how data is a muscle that some people train by accident. I did not ask for the footage, if it was needed. Petra would handle the request. I kept my hands clean because clean hands keep doors open. Day 12 reminded me that betrayal has a signature sound. Tessa's phone buzzed in a rhythm that felt like a small animal trying to get out of a box. She laughed and then caught herself. She left the room to answer. She returned with a face she believed to be neutral. I wrote nothing. I made tea. I poured it for both of us. She said thanks and called me a saint without moving her lips much. Saints prefer quiet rooms. I am not a saint. I am a man learning how to count without becoming cruel. Day 13 drifted in with a light rain and a text from Petra that listed 3 reminders in simple words. Save. Eat. Sleep. I typed back that I would obey. I then drove to a part of the city where the hotel from Day 3 lives and stood across the street in a coat that does not attract eyes. I watched a valet retrieve cars with a choreography that was almost religious. I listened to the tires bump the curb. I saw Tessa exit with a man whose jaw tried too hard. They did not touch. They did not need to. They walked in the way people walk when they believe they deserve a secret. I noted the time and the make of the car he entered. I did not photograph their faces. I kept my distance as if distance were a moral code. Day 14 was a Sunday that carried the smell of old coffee and newspapers. I visited my mother and told her that work had gone strange and that I would need to lean into quiet for a month. She served a stew that could forgive a calendar. She cut bread with a knife that had belonged to my grandfather and told me that men in our family do not need to shout in order to be heard by themselves. I drove home with the windows cracked and the radio off. The city looked the same and did not feel the same. That is how it goes when a map rotates under your feet. On day 15, I moved money. I left enough in the shared account to cover our ordinary bills and redirected the rest to an account in my name that had waited politely in the background for years. I canceled an automatic transfer that no longer made sense and paused a charge that had begun to look like a tribute to someone else's dream. I documented each change with a screenshot and an explanation line. I sent the file to Petra with the subject line, "Rebalancing without drama." She replied with a thumbs up that looked like a friend. She does not use emoticons often, which made the moment feel earned. Day 16 tried to behave like any other day until evening, when Tessa packed again. She said she had a client dinner with a potential long-term contract. She wore a jacket that made her shoulders look like a promise, and shoes that made the floor sound brighter. I replied that I hoped the meeting would go well, and that I would be asleep by 10 because I had an early call. She nodded and left with a wave that did not make it to her eyes. The doorbell camera caught her leaving. The time synced with the phone screenshot. The city ate her taillights. I drove to a river path and walked in cold air until my lungs admitted they were alive. I thought about truth. Truth is heavier than lies, but it needs fewer repairs. I walked back to the car when my hands began to ache and sat with the engine off. I watched a train slide past the bridge and disappear like a thought that keeps its distance. Then I drove home and slept without dreaming. On day 17, I met with Petra again. We sat in a quiet room and she asked questions that moved the story forward by inches that later would equal miles. She spoke of filing a petition and of temporary orders that protect assets and define conduct. She said we could proceed at the end of the 30 days or sooner if certain lines were crossed that could not be tolerated. She asked me to consider whether the delay was helping me or hurting me. I told her that I needed the full month to let my mind catch up with the facts. She accepted this and wrote a note on a legal pad with a pencil that had endured many cases. I watched the pencil point scratch the paper like a small ship, making a map of a new coastline. Day 18 carried a small gift. My junior teammate brought me a coffee and said I had been kind when others had not. She wanted to return something of that steadiness. I took the cup and felt it warm my fingers and some part of me deeper than that. I thanked her and kept my voice level. Later, she would ask me how one keeps calm when people around you are loud. I would tell her that counting helps, and that most storms can be outlasted by a sturdy chair and a working clock. Day 19, a Thursday, revealed a valet log that would later matter. I had called the hotel and asked for a general record of vehicle movements for a night that matched the deposit date. The manager said that logs were private. I asked whether a legal request would be honored. The manager said yes and offered to store the logs so they would not be overwritten. I thanked the manager in the way a person thanks a bridge from a distance. I called Petra and told her what had been said. She filed a preservation letter that afternoon. The world works when people do their basics. That day it worked. Day 20 announced itself with a bank alert that a new card had been added for contactless payments. I checked and saw a vendor line that matched a boutique where Tessa once said the mirrors were gentle. I did not judge anyone for wanting to be seen by kind glass. I wrote the vendor name in the file. I took a run, even though the air had a bite. Running brings me back to my body when my head tries to form too many committees. I came home and made eggs and ate them slowly, as if they contained instructions for courage. Day 21. I began drafting the statement I would want to read to myself on the last day. Not a speech for an audience. A note to a man who survived by trusting small tools. The note contained 4 lines. I honored fact over fury. I protected resources that feed the future. I refused theater. I chose a door that opens toward daylight. I placed the note on my desk and left it beside the keyboard like a calm witness. Day 22 stepped forward with an odd gift. Tessa left a jacket hanging by the door with a receipt in the pocket for a dinner that ended too late for anyone who needed to wake early. The receipt had a phone number scribbled on the back, with a name that started with G. I put the paper in a plastic sleeve and added a line about where I had found it. I did not call the number. The story was already complete enough for the plan. I do not chase confession when documentation does the work. Day 23. I ran into Grant near a coffee shop. He is a sales manager with a smile that works until he runs into someone who has numbers. He greeted me with warmth that felt like a coat on the wrong person. He asked about Tessa with a tone that tested how much I wished to bleed. I kept my answer short. He said he had to run and left with a handshake that lasted a second too long. My palm felt like it had shaken a flyer. I went home and wrote 2 sentences about the encounter. Tone neutral. Facts only. Day 24 was a Saturday, with sky the color of a soft eraser. I cleaned the porch and tightened a loose screw on the railing. I repaired a hinge inside the pantry that had been complaining for months. I swept under the refrigerator and found 4 coins and a toy car that belonged to a neighbor kid who visits once a week. Maintenance is not glamorous. Maintenance is how a person keeps vows to a place. I looked at the line on the wall where sunlight pauses in the afternoon, and I felt the house stand with me. Houses know when you show up. Day 25 found Tessa trying tender. She made breakfast and talked about maybe planning a trip to the coast in spring. I listened and ate and did not offer a script. She asked if I wanted to attend a concert with her in 2 weeks. I told her I could not plan that far until I cleared a work project that had become important. She shrugged and hummed. Later, she went out and left a note that said she would be home late. I saved the note by taking a photo because paper left on kitchen islands tends to travel. Day 26, the neighbor with the street camera waved me over and said the city had responded to his noise complaint with a polite form letter. He laughed and said, "Form letters are the lullabies of municipal government." I agreed and asked him to send me a copy, which he did. I placed it in the folder because pattern matters and often the world produces supporting documents if you give it time. That night, I cooked a simple pasta and ate it with bread that tasted like a small field doing its best. Day 27. I met Petra again, and we reviewed the file like two people testing a raft before taking it to a river. She said the documentation was steady. She said the financial picture supported a request for constructive trust on funds spent for hotel rooms and dinners that fed an affair. She said the preservation letter on the Valet logs would hold. She recommended that we move forward at the end of the 30 days with a filing that was both firm and clean. She asked me how I wanted to deliver the news to Tessa. I told her I would speak very little and hand over a sealed envelope containing the timeline and the letters. She nodded once. Day 28 was for logistics. I contacted a company that specializes in supervised retrievals from shared homes. I scheduled a window for the following week. I contacted a locksmith and scheduled a cylinder replacement that would happen after that window closed. I gathered Tessa essentials and placed them in transparent bins with labels that stated simply the contents and the aim of keeping stress minimal. Printed a copy of the timeline with timestamps and references, and I sealed it in an envelope with a letter from Petra that explained the road ahead. I did not rehearse any dramatic line. I rehearsed silence. Day 29. I slept badly, and then laughed at myself for imagining that sleep was owed to me by the calendar. I went for a run before dawn and watched the river carry an early boat that cut a gentle line through the water. I returned home and drank water and stared out the window until a small courage returned. I packed a small bag for myself in case I needed to leave the house for an hour after the conversation. I reviewed the envelope and the schedule and the emergency contacts. I placed my own birth certificate and passport in the safe with the file. I thanked the safe with my hand on its cool surface. Day 30 arrived without fanfare. Tessa came home from a gym class and set her bag on the bench like any other day. I asked her to sit at the table because I had a decision to share. She looked at me as if she was calculating how to buy time. I did not fill the air with a preface. I said that for 30 days I had observed, documented, and prepared. I said I was filing for divorce and that I would proceed kindly but firmly. I placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward her. I told her that any further communication would be through counsel. I told her that her essentials were ready by the door and that a supervised pickup could be scheduled for the rest. I ended with a sentence about dignity and health. Then I stopped. She opened the envelope and read the timeline with a face that tried to remain arranged. She read Petra's letter and the short explanation for constructive trust. She did not shout. She did not cry. She asked if I had told anyone. I said I had informed only the people who needed to know. She stood and walked to the door, then turned and asked if there was any world where I would reconsider. I told her that my decision had been made, and that my duty now was to protect the future calmly. She nodded and left with her gym bag, then returned to take the labeled bins. She did not look back. The door closed softly. I sat for a long time with my hands flat on the table. The house made the small sounds houses make when they decide to survive. A neighbor started a mower down the block. A siren pawed the air in the distance and then became memory. I stood, washed the mug in the sink, and wiped the table one more time. The cloth smelled like lemon and work. I felt both relief and grief in waves that did not knock me off my chair. I texted Petra to say that the envelope had been delivered. She replied with a simple "see you in the morning." The next week moved like a train that knows its route. We filed. The court stamped. Tessa countered with a narrative that called me cold and controlling. Petra answered with the record. A judge reviewed temporary orders and set boundaries that felt fair in a world that does not always aim for that. I kept paying the bills I should pay. I kept saving the files I should save. I kept moving my body and feeding it. I allowed myself no speeches and gave myself many chores. Chores heal what speeches damage. Grant received a visit from his own Human Resources Department after an anonymous packet containing 2 receipts and a copy of a policy landed on a desk. I did not send the packet. I had sent a letter through Petra weeks earlier, nothing more. The rest happened because systems work when given a chance. Grant did not lose everything. He lost enough to rethink his routines. Tessa told mutual friends that I had ruined her life. Some believed her and some did not. I did not chase any of them. You cannot catch a rumor without becoming one. The court recognized the misused funds and ordered amounts to be returned. The language in the order was dry, in the way healthy instructions are dry. It laid out numbers and dates and a logic path that felt like the inside of a clock. I kept the house. Tessa kept the car she loved. We divided furniture without pretending that furniture remembers love. I sold the couch a week later because I did not want to be tutored by ghost stories every evening. The buyer carried it away with relief that matched my own. By the time the decree was final, my 30-day file had grown into a memory palace with hallways I did not need to walk anymore. I put it in the safe with the deed and a few family papers, and I locked the door. I promised myself that I would not open it unless a court asked me to or my future needed a lesson. I hope neither happens. I prefer new paper with new grocery lists and new plans that have no lies attached. What I learned over those 30 days does not fit into slogans. It fits into the quiet inside the body when a person finally knows he will not tolerate the kind of harm that comes with applause. I learned that calm is a discipline and not a mood. I learned that documentation is not obsession. It is a way to listen when voices are busy selling you a show. I learned that lawyers are not magicians, but that the good ones hold a light steady while you do the work you wish had not become necessary. I learned that friends who can hold silence without fear are worth more than clever allies. I learned that a home rewards care with a kind of loyalty I had forgotten how to receive. I also learned that grief wears many uniforms. Some days it looks like anger with nowhere to go. Some days it tastes like metal and stays behind the teeth. Some days it sits on the sofa and watches you fold laundry. Some days it puts on a coat and walks with you to the river and says nothing as the water remembers how to move. I did not try to banish it. I gave it chores, too. Help me sweep, help me wash, help me return a neighbor casserole dish. Grief worked when I gave it work. After the dust settled, I wrote a note to my future self and taped it inside the hall closet where panic used to live. The note said only this: choose structure, choose daylight, choose the next right thing over the perfect thing. I read it each morning for a week and then forgot it was there. Forgetting is its own achievement. It means the lesson turned into a habit. People ask what I would do differently, and I tell them the truth. I would have started the ledger sooner. I would have eaten better in week 2. I would have told my mother earlier that I needed her stew. I might have taken one more run by the river when the day was thorny. I would not have shouted. I am proud of that. Shouting turns you into a witness against yourself. The final meeting with the judge lasted 8 minutes. Papers were signed. The clerk stamped clean ink on clean lines. The room did not hum or crackle. It breathed. Tessa left with her attorney, and I left with Petra. We walked down a hallway that looked like every hallway in every public building that ever tried to be useful. Outside, the day had the color of paper and the smell of exhaust. Petra shook my hand and told me to live well. I thanked her for being a lighthouse on 2 legs. She laughed and told me to eat, then walked toward her next case. I drove home on streets that had built themselves back during the months of my distraction. I parked and climbed the steps and opened the door and stood in the quiet like a person just released from a too-loud theater. I opened windows and let the room inhale. I made soup and cut bread and ate both with slow gratitude. I washed the pot and set it to dry. I lay on the rug and listened to the house settle into its evening. I fell asleep there and woke with a line on my cheek from the seam of the carpet, and smiled because lines fade and work remains. Friends came back in their own time. One knocked with a six-pack and no advice. Another sent a text that said, "Only proud of your steadiness." A third invited me to a game night and then forgot to keep score, which felt like a philosophy. We did not discuss the past long. We rolled dice and laughed like people who had been shown a painting of a storm and decided to learn the names of the clouds instead of dramatizing the wind. Work kept me honest. Deadlines have no patience for melodrama. I built dashboards that told the truth about performance and risk. I presented results with calm arrows and sober colors. Clients thanked me for clarity and paid invoices on time. I mentored a new hire who entered the office with the speed of someone trying to outrun a mistake. I taught him to breathe before he typed. By spring, he had become a person who could hold a meeting together with nothing but accurate data and a voice that avoided theater. The most rewarding stories are small and repeat every day. I took a trip to the coast with a map I had pinned months earlier. I drove a road that followed the ocean like a polite dog. I stopped at a diner that served honest eggs and coffee that had no ambition beyond warmth. I sat on a bench at dusk and watched the horizon refuse to be rushed. I thought about day 1 and day 30 and all the days in between. I thought about Tessa and wished her competence and quiet. I thought about Grant and hoped he would learn to love rules that keep people safe. I thought about Petra and decided to send a note of thanks after I returned. I thought about my mother's stew and made a plan to visit next Sunday. When I got back to the city, the house held the same furniture and a different weather. I kept my routine because routine is a long bridge. I trimmed a plant by the window and watered the herbs on the sill and sent 3 emails I had been avoiding. I felt something like joy that did not announce itself. It just behaved like a good hinge. The door closed when I asked it to. The door opened when I asked it to. The metaphor wrote itself and then excused itself from duty. As months passed, I stopped reciting the file in my head. The world filled with other stories that demanded attention. A friend changed jobs. A neighbor had a baby who decided to arrive on a Tuesday. A cafe closed and another opened with bread that made everyone inclined to forgive the early service errors. I walked through all of it with a posture that felt earned. I had not won a battle. I had built a life that stopped asking me to perform in a play that hurt my throat. On the anniversary of day 30, I wrote a single sentence on a card and slid it into the file before I locked it again. The sentence said this: "You did not learn how to punish. You learned how to protect. Protection is a craft, and you are allowed to be proud of practicing it well." I slid the card in and closed the safe and went for a run along the river where the water keeps secrets and tells truths in the same breath. A man in the park asked me once what advice I would give to someone who suspects but does not know. I told him to build a small daily ledger of facts only. I told him to move money gently and legally. I told him to eat 3 real meals and to sleep even when sleep refuses. I told him to borrow a calm voice from the future and let it speak for him when his own voice wants to burn bridges. He thanked me and walked toward a bench with the kind of step a person takes when he knows a storm is coming, and he has finally decided to use his umbrella. Life never became a victory parade. It became something better. A sequence of days that kept their promises. A house that forgave when I fumbled. A job that rewarded recordings of truth. A kitchen that always had eggs and a pan that had learned my style. A circle of friends who knew how to arrive and leave without making messes. A mother who still insisted on sending me home with leftovers. These things add up to a life, even when no one is writing about it. If you ask what I learned after 30 days of witnessing betrayal, I will answer with this. I learned that the person I am when I refuse spectacle is a person I respect. I learned that legal paper can be a shield and not merely a sword. I learned that I am allowed to build a fence around my peace and to enforce its gate without apology. I learned that repair can be a joy when it is not an attempt to return to a false past, but a way to protect a real future. I learned that kindness toward myself makes me less interested in winning over anyone else. I learned that daylight is worth waiting for. The decision I made on day 30 was not the end of my patience. It was the beginning of a different patience. The patience of brushing my teeth well and showing up for work early. The patience of answering messages without hostility. The patience of replacing the battery in the smoke detector before it chirps. The patience of a life that has nothing to sell and everything to maintain. I like this patience. It holds. I do not know what Tessa tells herself now. I hope her story makes room for responsibility and leaves no space for cruelty. We were not always a disaster. We had good seasons that still deserve respect. I can honor that without bringing any of it back into my kitchen. The line between those two acts is a clear river, and I have learned how to stay on my bank. Sometimes at night, I walk to the window and stand with the light off and look at the city pretending not to be tired. I think about the man I was before the 30 days and the man I am now. The difference is not loud. It is a notch in the voice and a steadiness in the hand that turns a key. I am no hero. I am a clerk of my own safety, a steward of my own time. When I lie down to sleep, I thank the quiet for staying, and I promise to be a good host. That is my decision, and it stays made. I wake, boil water, grind beans, listen to the kettle, and feed myself. I check the lock, pocket my wallet, and carry a short list. I write down what matters. I let go of what does not. I walk out the door and into a day that minds its own business. The door closes behind me with a sound I have learned to love. It is the sound of a life that is under decent management. In the weeks after the decree, I taught myself to cook 3 dishes with no drama. A simple roast chicken that cooperates when treated with patience. A bean stew that rewards low heat and time. A pot of rice that finishes without fanfare. Feeding myself quietly became a daily victory. The kind that never posts about itself. I built a small garden box on the balcony with herbs that tolerate neglect. Basil that forgives, thyme that whispers, mint that refuses to be contained. Every morning I pressed a finger into soil and learned to water only when the plant asked. Discipline, like moisture, cannot be poured in advance. You wait, you check, you respond, and the green persists. Ava came by my desk with a question about a report that would not reconcile. We traced a decimal that had wandered. We taught the spreadsheet to mind its columns. She smiled and said she liked the way I treated errors as visitors rather than enemies. I told her that mistakes are often messengers with bad shoes. I wrote small thank you notes to people who had been kind in forgettable ways. The neighbor who brought my bins in during a storm. The clerk who waived a late fee when a bill fell behind an email filter. The librarian who pointed me to a quiet table when teenagers discovered volume. The notes took 5 minutes each and returned a week of goodwill to my house. Sometimes I felt an old anger scratching at the door. I let it in for 10 minutes, asked it to sit, and gave it a list of tasks. Take out the trash, sweep the kitchen, wiped down the sink. By the time the list ended, the anger had turned into breath and sweat and a floor that looked like respect. On Sunday evenings, I called my mother and gave her the short version of the week. She told me about her neighbor who plants marigolds, as if they could indict humidity. We laughed the way two people laugh when they have decided to keep what is simple. After the call, I wrote 3 tasks for Monday and slept without inventing speeches. Morning arrived and kept its word. I stopped checking the old social feeds. At first, I missed the sensation of watching a door I knew would not open. Then I realized I had been guarding a hallway that served no one. I turned the screen off and turned toward the bookshelf. Pages are more generous than feeds. One afternoon, I walked past the hotel in Back Bay that had once commandeered my attention. The awning was the same. The bellman had a new hat. Guests came and went with rolling bags that sounded like distant rain. The building no longer had a claim on my heart rate. Indifference is sometimes the final stage of healing. I took up running intervals along the river path. Fast to one light post, easy to the next. I learned that progress hides in effort that looks ordinary from the outside. Sweat documented what no caption could. After a month, I could hold a pace that once made me doubt my lungs. At work, we faced a crunch with a client whose data warehouse had begun to sag under the weight of its own enthusiasm. I built a plan that involved fewer moving parts and more reality. We trimmed queries that tried to be famous. We left in the ones that turned lights on for real decisions. After the deploy, the client called me calm. It felt like a promotion, even though it was only a sentence. A cousin asked me to speak to his class about careers that require steadiness. I stood in a room with scuffed floors and eager faces and told them the truth. Find work that rewards boring excellence. Build routines that do not collapse when eyes are on you. Document what you do so that future you can say thank you to present you. I replaced the old couch with 2 sturdy chairs and a small table that holds tea and a book without sulking. The room changed shape without asking permission. Evenings became conversations with myself that did not require translation. The chairs never asked about the past. They just held me up. The neighbor kid retrieved his toy car from behind my refrigerator and looked at me like I had performed a rescue. He asked how it had gotten there. I said that gravity and curiosity enjoy each other. He nodded as if this were a profound secret. Then he ran back outside to invent trouble that did not end in court. I made a short trip to the mountains and stayed in a cabin with a stove that clicked like an old metronome. I walked a trail that switched back on itself as if to practice humility. At the summit, I did not raise my arms. I stood still and let the wind remove any leftover vanity. On the way down, I stepped carefully, because pride always waits near loose gravel.